to me, there was real drama in some of the actual tradecraft. So that surveillance detection route, that SDR, is moving from point A to the point where you're meeting the asset. And there's a very complicated dance around how you do that so that you fit into your pattern of life, so that it doesn't look suspicious to the host government's intelligence services, because you're not trying to look like you're operational. You're trying to look like you're boring, like you're going shopping, like you're going out with your family, you're going to a restaurant. But all the while, you're trying to process the information around you to understand if someone's watching. And if they are, you'll lead them to the agent, to the asset.
My next guest, the former CIA analyst, David McCloskey, who spent years working in the Middle East. Well, now he's turned his hand to writing best-selling spy novels, using his, forensic insider knowledge to lift the curtain on the world of espionage. His debut novel is called Damascus Station, and it's just been shortlisted for the British Book Awards 2024. And David, welcome to the programme. Good afternoon.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, obviously, I don't understand the world of what it's like being a CIA agent. And I know there's a very sort of significant onboarding process. But when you leave, what rules are you given about kind of what details you can disclose to the public?
Yeah, so they do put you in a small room on your last day and make you sign a whole bunch of papers that effectively, prohibit you from revealing much that's, intensely classified in the, in the years that follow. And I remember actually asking stupidly for copies of those papers. The room sort of feels like a broom closet. The woman who was in there had looked like she had maybe never left that room in about 40 years. And I stupidly asked for the copies of the paper. She said, "Oh, honey, of course not. You can't have these. These are classified." But basically, it says, if you write something, you have to send it through what's called our publication review board. And that applies to resumes, that applies to, op-eds, that applies to novels. So I send my manuscripts through that review board. They take things out that they think are maybe too sensitive. But like any good former spook, I guess, I do a decent amount of self-censorship as well to make sure nothing really sensitive.
I was about to say this is a live interview, and so they haven't been able to vet the questions that I'm going to ask you, it has to be said. So when they vetted your manuscripts, because you're writing fiction, but of course it's steeped in your experience of what it's like being a CIA agent, was there anything that they said, actually, no, David, this is too sensitive, we've got to take it out, without telling us what it was?
That's the trick, isn't it? I mean, they did say there were a few things they wanted taken out. It was fairly minor at the end of the day. And that's actually been the case across each of the now 3 books that I've sent to them. I'm doing some of that legwork for them up front, rightfully so. So at the end of the day, they're kind of taking out this little bit of tradecraft with a specific name. They tend to get a little sensitive when you mention very specific parts of the bureaucracy, things like that. So it's been actually relatively straightforward to deal with that process, thankfully.
And I think what's been so fascinating about reading through the manuscript is the kind of more mundane aspects of actually being in the CIA. It isn't all we know it isn't all drama, and there's kind of admin that has to be done. But things like the hot dog machines. I mean, which bits did you think? I guess when you're living it day to day, it's hard to think, oh, maybe the public would be interested in these more boring parts.
Well, yeah, so I do like to include some of those bureaucratic or procedural aspects. You never want them to gum up a good story, and they certainly can slow things down, but some of them are just too good to pass up. I think the hot dog machine is one of them. I remember even when I worked there thinking it was quite bizarre that such a machine existed. I had never seen one anywhere else in my entire life, anywhere in the world. I did not know that such technology existed. I've only seen it in the Langley basement. And I do remember watching that hot dog machine get loaded and thinking it sort of looked like it was a belt-fed machine gun. Someone's loading it in the middle of the night while I'm down there getting something after the cafeteria is closed. But those little details, I think, about life in the espionage business or the secret world are so fun, because really you are dealing with a big bureaucracy. You're dealing with people. and that kind of there's a drama there or a bit of intrigue, I think, in showing the mundane aspects and how they impact the characters in the novel. So I really try to do that in my stories if I
Yeah,
can.
of course. I mean, the Times describe it as being, I mean, I don't know how they would know this, but being the most authentic spy thrillers in years that's been written, partly because of that. You're putting in some of the more basics. I mean, tell me about, things like the hours of travel required to kind of shake off surveillance teams, or some of the very sort of more mundane places where you're kind of swapping secret messages with someone and it isn't kind of as we'd imagine in the movies.
Yeah, unfortunately, so I joined the agency when I was fairly young, and after about 2 days there, you kind of look around and say, this isn't anything like any of the movies,
Mm,
and it really does have some, the real, like you mentioned, surveillance detection routes, right? Uh, Going to meet an asset, right? In the movies, someone just kind of goes there. Maybe there's a car chase. There's probably some shooting, things that, by the way, hardly ever, if ever, happen. But to me, there was real drama in some of the actual tradecraft. So that surveillance detection route, that SDR, is moving from point A to the point where you're meeting the asset, and there's a very complicated dance around how you do that so that you fit into your pattern of life, so that it doesn't look suspicious to the host government's intelligence services, because you're not trying to look like you're operational. You're trying to look like you're boring, like you're going shopping, like you're going out with your family, you're going to a restaurant. But all the while, you're trying to process the information around you to understand if someone's watching. And if they are, you'll lead them to the agent, to the asset, right? So you
mm.
have to back off a board, don't have the meeting. To me, there was real human drama in that. There's real tension in that. And I really wanted to show the reality of that, that spycraft, that tradecraft in the
Yeah.
book, just because I thought it has these dramatic tones to it that are very rarely explored in most spy fiction.
Yeah, your book is all about this sort of case officer, Sam Joseph, who's really talented at reading people undercover in the embassy in Damascus. And that does sort of lend from your experience. Just tell us where you were stationed in the midst of sort of Syria's civil war, how sort of difficult and turbulent a time that was.
Yeah, so I worked on Syria most of my time at CIA, both from the region and from Langley. And when I started on what we call an account, Syria, it was kind of a sleepy would be the wrong word, but there wasn't a tremendous amount of policymaker interest in the country. And then, of course, when the Arab Spring happened, we just tipped into this world of protests, insurgency, civil war, and eventually the state broke apart. And so that period for me personally and professionally was really quite impactful and quite moving, because we watched this whole country just fall apart,
Mm.
and the amount of human suffering and tragedy that was a part of that is just really astounding. And I think it's really fallen off the front pages here, at least in the States, because there's bigger issues now that have popped up internationally. But I really I love that country, that place, the people, and I wanted to tell a story about people, real authentic people in the midst of this really inhuman conflict.
Yeah.
That was important to me.
I think it's also hard to do that. I mean, Syria is a place that we've often read about, but I'm sure most of us have never been, probably never will go. And it's in part because of the stories that you were working in the midst of, and the civil war, and how that all developed. So, how do you sort of portray as well that country in a way that you think accurately reflects it, rather than just painting out? I mean, somewhere it's been written that it's not just kind of the bad guys.
Yeah. Well, that was important to me when I started, was how do I not paint a bunch of cartoon villains that maybe are more at home in a different type of spy thriller. I didn't want to do that. I really started with characters, and I thought, okay, how can I how can I create real Syrian characters that are working, in the palace, or working in the intelligence services, or have taken up with rebel groups, and how can I just get under their skin and hear those voices and write the stories down that those voices, that those
Mm,
voices tell me, right? And to me, it started there. How do I punch windows into a lot of different perspectives on the country and the conflict, and just kind of deal with those stories as they are. And of course, we've got some nasty guys in this book, but a lot of the characters, who do nasty things are also doing noble things in other areas or at other points in the story. And I think that captures something real about the war and the conflict that we often don't see here when we experience it through the press or through very politicized narratives.
I wonder why it was you decided to write a fiction story based on those experiences. What kind of motivated you?
Well, I was thinking that old lady up in that broom closet probably wouldn't let me tell the nonfiction story. They were going to edit that thing pretty
Yeah.
severely. Um, so there was, but in all seriousness, I think when I left the agency, I was really processing the Syrian war, and I just started to write. And I found that a lot of what I was writing was fiction, although I was taking stories that I had heard or experienced and kind of adapting them and finding that that was a more effective way for me to understand how I felt about the war
Mm,
and what had happened. And I just kind of went with that, not thinking or expecting that it would turn into anything.
mm.
And for a long time, it didn't. But it started as kind of this, I don't even know where it came from because I'd never written creatively before. All my writing had been highly classified stuff inside CIA that's
Yeah.
very analytical. So here it was a very different change of form, but I found that freeing, and I found that it was a way for both me to process things and also to tell stories that I felt
Of
needed to be
course.
told. And so I just went with it.
And that's where we get a glimpse of actually the authentic CIA work. Catherine's just texted in with a text, and this might be a total myth, but I'd just like to ask you, from what we have just been discussing, the very serious to the less so. I'm desperate to know, ask Catherine and David, if they still use invisible ink. Can you tell us that? If
All right.
ever.
Well, so as one fun side note, the creative writing group inside the CIA, which I was not a part of, is called Invisible Ink. So
Oh,
that's one
right.
fun fact. There is a creative writing group inside the agency at Langley. It's called Invisible Ink. Um, that kind of tradecraft, it's certainly based on real stuff. I mean, it's been used for hundreds of years. I think in some contexts it probably still is. I don't know for certain, but I will say that the tremendous proliferation of cameras, sensors, phones, biometrics, the ability to store that data for a long time, the ability to analyze it, has made the digital world one that is actually extremely fraught for human agents and for the conduct of espionage and for communicating covertly with people. And so there is kind of I think, in some contexts, a tilt back to what we would call sticks and bricks
Mm.
tradecraft, which is, stuff that's not digital, right? And secret writing and visible ink, those kind of things could certainly play a role in that. So I think those time-tested methods, are they endure for a reason, and I would expect it's in use in some capacity today.
There we go, Catherine. I think that was a yes. It is still used in some in some capacity. David, thank you so much for talking to us. David McCloskey, and Damascus Station has been shortlisted for the British Book Awards 2024. Winners are going to be announced at an in-person ceremony on the 13th of May. It's been fascinating, David. Thank you so much.